In 2010, Scott Pilgrim took over San Diego Comic-Con, where fans could talk with creative talent, watch trailers, and play the Scott Pilgrim video game. What made the Scott Pilgrim transmedia experience unique was the glue that united the comic, film, and video game. Instead of relying on narrative to invite customers to synergistic texts, the creators drew upon the visual style of Brian Lee O'Malley's books. O'Malley's use of video game aesthetics and the ways in which Edgar Wright remediated them have already been discussed in Matthias Storck's visual essay. The purpose of this essay is to peel back the layer behind that and to analyze how the Scott Pilgrim transmedia experience remediated comics. The concept of transmedia is often synonymous with storytelling. As Henry Jenkins defines the industrial and narrative phenomenon, it is a story that unfolds across multiple media platforms. For Jenkins, a key example is the Matrix franchise, which provided a story that could only be fully comprehended after the consumer watched 3 feature films, played a video game, and watched a series of animated shorts. The trend is motivated by the economics of the horizontally integrated Hollywood studio system and can result in a tremendous monetary bounty. For instance, Warner Bros. Not only benefited from the box office grosses of the films, but gained further revenues from the Enter the Matrix video game and the direct-to-video film The Animatrix. As Jenkins quotes Senior Vice President of Marketing at Warner Bros., quote, "This truly is Warner Bros. Synergy. All divisions will benefit from the property. We don't know what the upside is, we just know it's going to be very high." That assessment seems to have been hopelessly optimistic. The budgets of the Matrix films increased while their box office grosses decreased. In both Jenkins' assessment and those of prominent film critics at the time, the economic decline of the franchise was tied to its ambitious narrative construction, demanding too much from casual viewers and providing little return for die-hard fans. When television writer Javier Grillo Marços was asked for his views on transmedia storytelling in the Dark Knight alternate reality game Why So Serious, the writer noted, quote, "If I had to do homework to understand Batman, I'd punch someone in the head." End quote. His sentiments seem to have been reinforced by Lost showrunners Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse, who spoke about supporting the mothership and not trying to alienate the average viewer. In the opinion of the entertainment industry, transmedia is far from being a successfully established concept, both in terms of narrative and economics. Jenkins considers alternatives to transmedia storytelling when he describes how filmmakers and art directors can implicitly direct our attention beyond the narrative and towards other aspects of the fictional world we inhabit as spectators. Expanding on Jenkins' theory, there has been a significant shift over the past decade, specifically in the genre of the comic book film. In some cases, studios are using style to bring viewers and consumers to ancillary texts. To briefly return to The Matrix, reviews of the video game were extremely telling in what players expected from the game. Reviewers were not talking about transmedia storytelling or how the video game filled in narrative gaps in the films. They were talking about how disappointed they were that they did not get to experience bullet time as Neo. I would argue that it was the transmedia style of bullet time, derived from a hybrid of comic books and Muybridge's motion studies, that successfully crossed media. Similarly, fans of Frank Miller's Sin City and his film adaptation are often drawn to discussing transpositions of noir that cross over from film to comic back to film. There is a collective intelligence aspect to these analyses of style as well. To best describe the stylistic and industrial phenomenon of transmedia style, a productive starting point is J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin's theory of remediation. For Bolter and Grusin, remediation is the representation of one medium in another. remediation differs from adaptation as a critical concept in two ways. To address form specifically, the term and concept of stylistic remediation is useful and should be defined as follows. The remainder of this essay will focus on outlining what exactly stylistic remediation is, and how, in the case of the Scott Pilgrim graphic novels, film, and video games, separate media creators utilize the translation of style to take customers beyond the film. We can see two types of stylistic remediation in this clip from Scott Pilgrim. The first type, graphical remediation, is depicted by the film's shift in representational mode from the photographic to the graphic. Here, Wright constructs the flashback around an animation constructed out of Brian Lee O'Malley's original panels. As the sequence progresses, Wright also engages in spatial remediation, abandoning the singular frame of film language in favor of the multi-frame that defines the comic book page. By tossing aside the continuity editing system that defines filmmaking, Wright's fracturing of the frame forces us to provide spatial closure to the sequence. Looking beyond Scott Pilgrim for just a moment, consider Zack Snyder's use of speed ramping in Watchmen as an example of temporal remediation. Snyder veers away from the cinema's relatively static relationship between time and space to give us a fluid moment in time. This captures both the ambiguous relationship between space and time in the comic panel and the subjective experience of reading. Finally, Scott Pilgrim remediates the textual and oral elements of the comic, which are represented by the use of graphically embellished words as icons and the formal devices of the word balloon and the caption. For Wright, the decision to remediate O'Malley's style was influenced by the Batman television series, which has a history of being looked down upon for its camp aspects and has been largely disavowed by the Batman fan community. Wright's decision works as the glue fusing the transmedia texts of the comics, film, video game, and arguably the film's soundtrack. By avoiding transmedia storytelling, the Scott Pilgrim experience appeases fans of the franchise without alienating the casual consumer with narrative homework. O'Malley's graphic novels first appeared on shelves in 2004. The book tells the story of Scott Pilgrim, a young 20-something who leads a rudderless life. After being dumped by his girlfriend, Pilgrim spends his days walking around the streets of Toronto, playing bass in his band Sex Bob-omb, and dating a high school student. He doesn't attend college, he doesn't have a job. Scott Pilgrim, like many members of Generation Y, defines himself through popular culture as he seeks to find his own identity, making his initial interactions with the literal girl of his dreams, Ramona Flowers, a bit awkward. Scott's quest for identity via popular culture is made particularly obvious by O'Malley's rather schizophrenic compositional style. First, O'Malley's title owes much to the manga mode. Essentially, O'Malley's graphical style abstracts his characters, placing them outside the realm of realism. He intersects the stripped-down style with the narrative and stylistic devices of the video game. Shortly after their release, the Scott Pilgrim comics occupied a unique position with regard to the film. The series was optioned by Universal, who put screenwriter Michael Bacall and Edgar Wright on screenwriting duties before the second title of the series was released in the summer of 2005. Wright and Bacall quickly wrote the first draft, focusing only on the first two books, before temporarily putting the project aside. Over the course of 2 years, O'Malley's series headed towards its eventual conclusion, while Wright decided to adapt all 6 books into one film. Significantly, when production began in 2009, O'Malley had yet to write the ending to the books. Because of this, Wright shot an original ending in which Scott ends up with Knives Chow, rather than his dream girl Ramona Flowers. However, after test screenings, Wright decided to reshoot the ending, consulting with O'Malley now that the writer had finished the books. Despite the fact that both texts were being developed simultaneously, a creative decision that can enable transmedia storytelling, the creative team did not want each medium to provide unique narrative information. Both the comic and the film construct the same story around the arc of Scott and Ramona's relationship. Let's bring this analysis full circle and look at how the Scott Pilgrim experience utilizes stylistic remediation as a transmedia tool. The linchpin to this argument is that Brian Lee O'Malley's comics remediate a range of different media from video games to music. Thus, Edgar Wright's remediation is a re-remediation. There's a different interpretive lens applied with each remediation as the artist adapts the previous medium into another. I mentioned earlier that this wasn't a simple adaptation because stylistic remediation can be a cyclical process. The best evidence of this complex process from the Scott Pilgrim experience is cyclical and involves a major device in the various texts, the extra life. In the book, Scott is killed in a final duel, and O'Malley brings him back with the gaming device of the extra life. O'Malley graphically remediates the low-res style of Nintendo games by applying a half-tone pattern over the icon. To design the film's version of the 1-Up icon, Wright brought in art director and lead Scott Pilgrim game designer Paul Robertson. Robertson decided to use the iconography of the Scott Pilgrim video game within the film. Unlike most tie-in video games, the graphical style is not based on the film. As O'Malley noted in an interview with me, quote, "We wanted to give people 3 separate experiences. The thing about the game is, when they make a movie tie-in game, it's usually something that feels shoddy. They do it quickly, and it feels like a cash-in. So the first thing we said when we sat down was we didn't want to see the cheap polygon version of Michael Cera fighting bad guys. That's no knock on Michael Cera, I just don't want to play him in a video game right now. I was really adamant on doing a cartoon style, and when Ubisoft hired Robertson, I knew we were on the right track." End quote. The 1-Up icon is modeled off of the color sketches of O'Malley's books that Robertson has remediated. This may seem like an Easter egg, placed into the film for those obsessive fans, making it largely irrelevant. However, given the narrative significance of the icon, and how the graphic representation of Scott clashes with the film's, it isn't hidden like most fan-appeasing Easter eggs. The video game-infused style of the comic was utilized as the foundation for its own video game, was extended into the film both in the 1-Up icon and a post-credits tag, and was ultimately cycled back around to the comics when Robertson designed an 8-bit art slipcase for the entire series. Essentially, O'Malley's stylistic remediation was utilized to organically motivate its transmedia sister properties. Stylistic remediation between comics and film is not a recent phenomenon. We can trace it back to the work of Winsor McCay, whose strips in the early 1900s exhibited filmic traits while his animations toyed with space, just like his comic panels. In its most recent iteration, stylistic remediation arguably began in the late 80s and early 90s with such films as Tim Burton's Batman and Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy. The economic and critical reception of stylistic remediation, like that of transmedia storytelling, has been mixed. This reception pattern has also marked more recent attempts, such as Zack Snyder's Watchmen and Ang Lee's Hulk. Scott Pilgrim was no exception. Garnering mixed reviews, the $60 million film grossed $47 million at the box office. The failure of the film at the box office has been attributed to multiple factors. One of the most cited reasons was Michael Cera saturation. The star, who had become a bit of a cult hero after appearing in Arrested Development, Superbad, and Juno, was beginning to be lampooned for typically being typecast as the sarcastic yet lovable loser. However, the film's economic implosion can also be attributed to an age gap in Hollywood demographics, and Universal's catering towards a vocal, invisible, yet ultimately minuscule geek crowd. The failure of previous films will not keep studios from greenlighting comic book movies, but it may teach them a pivotal lesson. Stylistic remediation and transmedia style can be a costly means of appeasing the original fan base. When it works, the transmedia property engine can, theoretically, drive consumers to purchase ancillary products in other media forms and can create a perpetual marketing machine. On the other hand, spreading content is itself an investment with production costs, and that must be kept in perspective. In conclusion, like Jenkins' opinion of transmedia storytelling, it is too early to declare the death of stylistic remediation or transmedia style in the larger picture of the industry. Even after the financial disaster of Dick Tracy more than 20 years ago, filmmakers and studios still attempted to use film form to match that of the comics, and some of them have been incredibly successful. It is only a matter of time before the next 300 or Sin City economically jumpstarts the stylistic cycle all over again.